Imagine stepping onto a plane, expecting just another flight, only to realize the captain flying it doesn't think you belong at the head of the airline. But what happens when the very woman he underestimated turns out to be his new boss? Power struggles, unspoken battles, and a fight for the future of an entire industry. This is the story of one flight that changed everything. Buckle up because this ride is about to get turbulent. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Imagine stepping onto a plane, expecting just another flight, only to realize the captain flying it doesn't think you belong at the head of the airline. But what happens when the very woman he underestimated turns out to be his new boss? Power struggles, unspoken battles, and a fight for the future of an entire industry. This is the story of one flight that changed everything. Buckle up because this ride is about to get turbulent. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The early morning air at Denver International Airport carried a crisp chill, the kind that clung to the skin even as the sun tried to stretch its golden arms over the horizon. Inside the bustling terminal, the steady hum of rolling suitcases and the murmur of hurried conversations blended into the background. Naomi Vance stepped through the automated doors of Vanguard Airlines' corporate headquarters, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Today was a moment she had worked her whole life for, her first day as the airline's new CEO. Yet despite the weight of the title, she moved with quiet confidence, her tailored navy blue blazer fitting perfectly over her frame, her presence composed but purposeful. She had been here before, stepping into spaces where she wasn't expected, where people like her, a black woman in a field dominated by white men, were often seen as outsiders. The old rules dictated that someone of her background shouldn't be standing at the top of one of the largest airlines in the country, but she had rewritten those rules herself. As she approached the reception desk, the young woman behind it barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but indifferent. Naomi offered a calm smile. "I'm here for a meeting with the executive team." The receptionist, still not making eye contact, began typing on her keyboard. "And your name?" Naomi took a breath before answering. "Naomi Vance." The woman's fingers paused. This was the moment, the realization, the same reaction she had seen countless times before. The receptionist's eyes flicked up quickly, then down again, as if unsure whether she should apologize for her initial dismissiveness. "Oh, Ms. Vance. Right, of course. Let me get someone to escort you." Her voice had changed, becoming just a touch more careful. Naomi merely nodded, unbothered but noting the subtle shift, a silent acknowledgement of the kind of day this was going to be. As she waited, she glanced around the modern, sleek interior of Vanguard Airlines headquarters. Employees hurried past, some engaged in animated discussions, others moving with the efficiency that only came from years in the industry. They had no idea she was here. Not yet. Beyond the glass doors leading to the executive wing, she spotted a cluster of men in pilot uniforms gathered near the lounge area. Their relaxed postures and occasional bursts of laughter suggested familiarity, a space where they belonged. One man stood out, his stature, his presence, the way the others seemed to naturally gravitate toward him. Grant Alden. She had read about him, seen his personnel file. A seasoned pilot, highly respected, but also someone known for his old-school mentality. His record was spotless, his skills undisputed. But his attitudes? That was something else entirely. Naomi observed as he leaned against the counter, his deep voice carrying just enough for her to pick up snippets of conversation. "I don't care who they put in that chair," he said, shaking his head. "All I know is, I'll keep flying the way I always have. I'm not here to play politics." One of the other pilots chuckled. "You worried they'll start pushing all that corporate diversity nonsense on us?" Grant smirked, taking a sip from his coffee. "All I'm saying is, let's hope whoever this new boss is knows their place." Naomi felt the weight of those words settle on her, familiar but still sharp. She had spent a lifetime walking into rooms where people assumed she didn't belong. And yet, here she was. She turned just as her escort arrived, a tall, clean-cut man with an apologetic smile. Ms. Vance, welcome to Vanguard Airlines, he said, extending his hand. I'm Richard from the executive team. If you'll follow me, I'll take you to your office. Naomi shook his hand firmly. Lead the way. As she walked past the group of pilots, she didn't slow her stride, didn't let her expression waver. Grant barely glanced in her direction. To him, she was just another face in the crowd. He had no idea who she was. Not yet. The Vanguard Airlines executive wing had a quiet, almost clinical feel to it. Glass-walled offices, muted colors, and the occasional hum of a coffee machine breaking the silence. Naomi followed Richard down the hall, her mind already organizing the day ahead. Here's your office, Richard said, pausing in front of a set of heavy wooden doors. The team will be meeting with you in about an hour, but if there's anything you need before then, let me know. Thank you, Naomi said, stepping inside. The office was spacious but impersonal, a blank slate waiting to be shaped. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the airport runways, where planes taxied and lifted into the sky. A symbol of motion, of forward momentum, just like her. Before she could fully take it in, a chime from her phone pulled her attention. A reminder, Flight 318, 10 a.m. Her first official act as CEO would be flying on one of Vanguard's commercial flights. An opportunity to observe, to assess the culture from the ground level before making any changes. It was something she had planned long before stepping into this role. She grabbed her coat and headed back down the hall, moving with the same measured confidence as before. She didn't need an entourage. She wanted to see how she would be treated as just another passenger. When she reached the gate, she spotted the flight crew gathered near the boarding area, and there he was again, Grant Alden. Naomi approached the group, stopping just short of them. A flight attendant noticed her first, offering a polite but distant smile. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Naomi returned the smile. "I'd like to speak with the captain of this flight." The attendant turned toward Grant, who was focused on something in his hands. Perhaps reviewing flight details, perhaps just avoiding unnecessary conversation. "Captain Alden," she called, "this passenger would like to speak with you." Grant barely looked up as he responded. "Tell them I don't do special requests." The casual dismissal was immediate, automatic. Naomi could see the flight attendant hesitate, glancing between them. Grant finally looked up, a flicker of irritation in his expression. His gaze moved over her, assessing, before he let out a small, unimpressed sigh. "If it's a seating issue, you'll have to take it up with the flight attendants, ma'am," he said. "I've got a plane to fly." Naomi remained still, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said. Grant gave a slight nod, already turning away. But before he could take another step, Naomi took out her phone, dialing a quick number. "This is Naomi Vance," she said into the receiver, her voice smooth and steady. "I need all senior flight crew for Flight 318 to report to the Horizon Conference Room immediately." Grant frowned. The name, Naomi Vance. His jaw tightened, a flicker of confusion passing over his features. It wasn't until the announcement came over the airport intercom that it hit him. "All senior crew for Flight 318, please report to the Horizon Conference Room immediately." The flight crew exchanged uncertain glances. Grant straightened, looking at Naomi again. Really looking this time. Something in his expression shifted. This wasn't just another passenger, and for the first time that morning he had no words. The Horizon Conference Room was located in a quieter section of the airport, away from the hum of hurried passengers and last-minute gate changes. The room itself was sleek, modern, long glass walls, a polished wooden table, and a projector screen that remained blank, waiting for its moment to display authority. Naomi walked in first, moving toward the head of the table, her heels tapping against the floor with a steady rhythm. She knew how to command a room without speaking, how to make her presence felt before a single word left her lips. One by one, members of the flight crew filed in, the first officer, the flight attendants, the ground operations manager. Then, finally, Grant Alden. He stepped in with the same confidence as always, but this time his usual self-assurance carried an edge of uncertainty. His eyes landed on Naomi, scanning her with something sharper than before. Not just irritation, but calculation. He was piecing something together, running back through their encounter at the gate, the way she had spoken with authority. Naomi remained seated as he took his place at the table. The room was silent, save for the quiet shuffling of papers from the operations manager. Richard, the executive who had escorted Naomi earlier, finally broke the silence. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice professional but firm. "Before we proceed with today's flight, our new CEO would like to address you all." A murmur moved through the room. New CEO? Heads turned toward Naomi, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to quiet surprise. Naomi leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table. She let the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. "My name is Naomi Vance," she said, her voice measured, steady. "As of this morning, I am officially the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Airlines." The quiet that followed wasn't just silence. It was thick. A pause stretched through the room, heavy with the realization that had just dropped. Grant barely blinked. There it was, the tightening of his jaw, the barely there shift in his posture, the flicker of disbelief that crossed his face before he masked it with indifference. For a long second, he said nothing. Then, as if adjusting his uniform was more important than responding, he exhaled and sat back, arms crossed. "Well," he said flatly, "that's a surprise." Naomi didn't react. She let his words settle, his resistance hang in the air like unfinished business. She had spent her career reading men like him, their calculated dismissiveness, their reluctance to acknowledge power in places they didn't expect it. She smiled, not in amusement, but in control. "Is it?" she asked simply. Grant's fingers tapped against the table, a slow, rhythmic motion that betrayed the fact that yes, it was. The operations manager, clearly eager to move past the tension, cleared his throat. "Well, Ms. Vance, welcome to Vanguard. I'm sure the team is looking forward to working with you." Naomi gave a nod. "I'm looking forward to it as well." She glanced around the room. "I understand change can be unexpected, but I didn't come here to disrupt what works. I came here to improve what doesn't." Her eyes flicked back to Grant for a half second, enough to let him know that she had heard every word he had said back at the pilot's lounge. "And I expect professionalism," she continued, "from everyone." Grant didn't break eye contact, but something in his jawline tightened. The meeting wrapped up soon after, the crew dismissed to return to their pre-flight duties. One by one they left, some lingering for a polite handshake, some moving quickly as if afraid to be caught in the tension. Grant was the last to stand. As he moved past Naomi, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then finally he spoke. "I don't like surprises," he muttered. Naomi glanced at him, unimpressed. "Then you're in the wrong business, Captain Alden." And with that, she walked away. By the time Naomi boarded Flight 318, the energy had shifted. Word had spread. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants stole quick glances at her, the way the first officer straightened his posture when she stepped onto the aircraft. Most passengers had no idea who she was. Just another traveler in first class, sipping water from a small plastic cup as she waited for takeoff. But the crew knew. And most importantly, Grant knew. From her seat, Naomi had a clear view of the cockpit door, which remained slightly ajar as the pilots finished their final checks. She could hear Grant's voice, low and clipped, speaking into his headset. She had no intention of making her presence a disruption, but she also wasn't here to be ignored. As the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, Grant finally stepped out, speaking briefly with a flight attendant. Naomi watched as he turned, scanning the rows. Their eyes met. For a second he hesitated, as if debating whether to acknowledge her or just keep walking. In the end, he gave a short nod. No words, just an acknowledgement. Begrudging, forced, but there. Naomi responded with the same measured nod. Then without another glance, he disappeared back into the cockpit. The flight took off smoothly, the engines roaring as the plane climbed through the clouds. Naomi leaned back, feeling the familiar sensation of altitude pressing against her chest. She had spent her life in and around airports, in boardrooms discussing the logistics of flight paths and operational efficiency. But there was something different about being in the sky now, knowing that the man in the cockpit didn't just see her as another CEO, but as an intruder, a disruption. Good. She hadn't come here to make things comfortable for people like Grant Alden. She had come here to change things. And whether he liked it or not, this was only the beginning. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a steady hum of quiet conversations, the occasional rustle of newspapers, and the rhythmic clinking of ice against plastic cups. Naomi Vance sat with her tray table down, absently stirring a cup of black coffee as she watched the clouds stretch endlessly beyond the window. It was a strange position to be in, both a passenger and the person in charge of everything happening inside this aircraft. The irony wasn't lost on her. From time to time, she glanced toward the cockpit door, its glossy surface reflecting the soft cabin lights. She wasn't expecting Grant Alden to make a scene. No, he was too calculated for that. But she knew men like him. They didn't react immediately. They let their resentment simmer, waiting for the right moment to push back. She didn't have to wait long. Midway through the flight, a flight attendant approached her with careful steps, a strained smile in place. Naomi recognized her from the pre-flight briefing. Carla Lopez, lead flight attendant, someone who had been with Vanguard for over 15 years. "Ms. Vance," Carla said softly, keeping her voice low. "Captain Alden wanted me to inform you that he would prefer if you didn't enter the cockpit during the flight." Naomi's brows lifted slightly. "I wasn't planning to." Carla's lips parted, then pressed together. "Right, of course. I think he assumed." Naomi let the words hang for a second, then smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "Did he ask you to tell any other passengers to stay out of the cockpit?" Carla's face flushed slightly and she looked down. "No, ma'am." Naomi gave a slow nod, setting down her coffee. "Thank you for passing along the message, Carla." The flight attendant lingered for a second, as if debating whether to say more, but in the end she simply nodded and walked away. Naomi exhaled quietly, leaning back in her seat. So, this was how Grant Alden was choosing to play it. Small power moves, petty reminders of authority. It was childish and predictable. Her fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. She had no intention of storming into the cockpit like some executive on a power trip. But now she was tempted. Instead, she picked up her phone and typed a brief message. "Noticed a bit of turbulence in my in-flight experience. We should talk when we land." She sent it to Richard, the executive who had escorted her that morning. Then she returned to her coffee, waiting. The landing at LaGuardia was smooth, but the tension remained thick as passengers disembarked. Naomi took her time gathering her belongings, knowing that Grant would have no choice but to walk past her on his way out. And sure enough, there he was, stepping out of the cockpit with his usual composed expression, but his shoulders a little too squared, his movements a little too stiff. He was bracing for something. She let him get 2 steps past her before she spoke. "Captain Alden." He stopped. It was subtle the way his jaw tensed before he turned, but Naomi caught it. "Ms. Vance," he said smoothly, expression unreadable. "I trust the flight was satisfactory." She tilted her head slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. "It was fine, though I did receive an interesting message mid-flight. Something about cockpit access?" Grant held her gaze, his face giving away nothing. "It's standard protocol to maintain a secure cockpit environment." She took a slow step toward him. "And was that protocol applied to everyone on this flight, or just to me?" The muscles in his jaw flexed for half a second before he let out a breath through his nose. "I don't have time for this." "Good," she said, stepping aside. "Neither do I." Grant started to move, but then, almost against his own better judgment, he turned back. "Look," he said, quieter this time. "I don't know what game you're playing here, but I don't have to like it." Naomi met his gaze, unwavering. "You don't," she said simply. "You just have to do your job." And with that, she walked past him, leaving him standing there among the thinning crowd, gripping the strap of his flight bag just a little too tightly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive from LaGuardia to Vanguard Airlines regional headquarters was quiet. Naomi stared out the window of the black company sedan, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and steel. The adrenaline from the flight was still in her system, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to refocus. She had meetings, schedules, and an entire workforce to manage. But none of that mattered if her own pilots didn't respect her authority. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a message from Richard. Hearing whispers from the pilot crew. "Seems Alden is stirring things up. Want me to intervene?" Naomi tapped her fingers against the leather seat, considering. Richard was efficient, but this wasn't a problem that could be solved with corporate emails and policy reminders. This needed to be handled head-on, she typed back. Number, I'll handle it. The car pulled up to the glass-paneled building that housed Vanguard's New York operations. Naomi stepped out, heels clicking against the pavement as she made her way inside. As expected, the meeting room was already filling up when she arrived. Regional directors, senior pilots, a few executives from corporate who had flown in for the session, and Grant Alden. He was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, listening but detached, his expression unreadable. But Naomi knew he had something to say. She took her seat at the head of the table. The room settled into a quiet murmur before Richard stood up to begin. All right, let's get started, he said. We'll be going over Vanguard's new leadership initiatives today. Ms. Vance has a few things she'd like to address first. Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. She met every pair of eyes in the room before she spoke. I'm aware that there's been discussion among the pilot corps regarding my appointment, she said, her voice calm but firm. So let's address it directly. A few exchanged glances. Some remained still, waiting. Grant didn't move. I didn't come here to disrupt what works, she continued. I came here to improve what doesn't. And that includes addressing the internal issues we've all been ignoring for too long. There it was, the unspoken truth laid out in the open, the elephant in the room acknowledged. Grant finally leaned forward, tapping a slow rhythm against the table. And what exactly are these internal issues you think we've been ignoring? His voice was even, but there was a challenge in it. Naomi didn't flinch. For starters, workplace culture, accountability, fair hiring practices. I could keep going. A small scoff came from the other end of the table. Jack Preston, one of Grant's closest colleagues, shook his head slightly. Sounds like corporate jargon to me. It's reality, Naomi countered smoothly. And it's changing. The weight of her words settled over the room. The men in front of her weren't used to being challenged, but she wasn't here to coddle them. Grant exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Look, Ms. Vance, he said, leaning back again. We're pilots. We fly planes. We don't do politics. What we care about is safety, efficiency, and getting passengers where they need to go. If you want to talk about real problems, let's talk about pilot shortages, not some corporate diversity checklist. Naomi's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, but her face remained neutral. You're right, she said. Your job is to fly planes. My job is to make sure this company doesn't collapse under outdated thinking. Grant stiffened, just for a second, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Naomi let the silence stretch before adding, I suggest we both focus on doing our jobs. Richard cleared his throat, sensing the tension. All right, let's move forward with today's agenda. But Naomi wasn't done. She turned toward Grant directly. Captain Alden, a word? A pause. Then slowly he stood up. This was going to be interesting. The meeting room emptied out, leaving only Naomi and Grant standing across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Naomi folded her arms. If you have something to say, say it. Grant exhaled sharply, as if deciding how much of a fight he wanted to pick. All right, he said. You want to know what I think? She waited. I think you're here to make a statement, he said, his tone even, but laced with something sharper. Not to run an airline. Naomi tilted her head slightly. And what statement would that be? Grant shrugged. That Vanguard isn't the same old boys club anymore. That people like me don't run things anymore. I get it. She stepped closer. People like you. Grant held her gaze. Pilots who've been here for decades. Who built this company? Who actually know how to run a flight deck? Naomi nodded slowly. So let me make sure I understand. You think leadership belongs to the people who've been here the longest? I think leadership belongs to the people who actually understand this industry, he corrected. Naomi studied him, then smiled, not out of amusement, but something closer to recognition. See, that's the problem, she said. You assume I don't. Grant's jaw flexed slightly. Naomi continued, stepping past him toward the door. I know you don't like this, she said, pausing just long enough for her words to land. But you're going to have to get used to it. Then, without waiting for a response, she walked away. Grant stayed behind, staring at the empty doorway, And for the first time, he realized he might have just met someone he couldn't outmaneuver. Grant Alden sat in the cockpit, fingers drumming lightly against the throttle controls. The pre-flight checks had already been completed, but his mind wasn't on the instruments in front of him. It was on her, Naomi Vance. He had dealt with corporate executives before, suits who thought they understood how an airline worked, but never spent a day in a flight deck. They'd make sweeping changes, implement their visions, and then move on when the numbers didn't match their expectations. But Naomi was different. She wasn't just passing through. She was here to stay, and she wasn't afraid to push back. That irritated him more than he cared to admit. "Captain?" Grant blinked and turned to his first officer, Mitchell Kane, who was eyeing him curiously. "You good?" Kane asked, adjusting his headset. Grant cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Yeah, just thinking." Kane chuckled. "Let me guess. The new CEO?" Grant shot him a sharp look, but Kane just smirked. "Everyone's talking about it," Kane continued, toggling a few switches as they taxied toward the runway. "You and Vance going head-to-head? That's the kind of thing that gets around fast." Grant exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. "I'm not going head-to-head with anyone. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." Kane hummed in response but didn't push further. The younger pilot had always been sharp, observant, but he knew when to let things be. The control tower's voice crackled through the radio, clearing them for takeoff. "Here we go," Grant muttered, gripping the throttle. The engines roared, and the aircraft surged forward, the sheer force pressing them into their seats as the wheels left the ground. The runway disappeared beneath them, the city shrinking in the distance. And yet, even at 30,000 feet, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control of where things were headed. Naomi stood by the large windows of Vanguard Airlines' executive office in Denver, watching the planes take off one after another. She had always loved airports, the movement, the structure, the way everything worked in perfect coordination, or at least how it was supposed to. She turned away from the view and back to her desk, where Richard was seated across from her, arms crossed. "You're making enemies fast," he said. Naomi smirked. "Good. That means I'm doing something right." Richard let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "I figured you'd say that." She sat down, folding her hands. "Grant Alden is a problem." Richard nodded. "That's putting it lightly." She tapped a pen against the desk. "How much influence does he actually have?" "Among the pilots?" Richard considered. "A lot. He's been here for over 20 years. People respect him, whether they agree with him or not. He knows how to rally them." Naomi wasn't surprised. "He won't make a direct move against you," Richard continued. "Not yet, but he's watching, waiting for you to slip up." Naomi exhaled slowly. She didn't plan on slipping up. She pulled a file from her drawer and slid it across the desk. "What's this?" Richard asked, opening it. "A formal proposal for a new pilot evaluation system," Naomi said. "One based on merit, not tenure." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You're taking on seniority?" She met his gaze. "It's outdated. It prioritizes who's been here the longest over who's actually the best for the job. That needs to change." Richard let out a low whistle. "You do realize that's going to start a war, right?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure we win." And with that, the next phase of the battle had begun. The Vanguard Airlines pilot lounge was buzzing. Soft murmurs, the occasional clatter of a coffee cup against ceramic, the hum of the TV in the corner cycling through financial news. Pilots drifted in and out, some reviewing flight plans, others lounging in the worn leather chairs, trading stories. But today the conversation wasn't about fuel efficiency or turbulent routes. It was about Naomi Vance. Grant Alden sat at one of the tables, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Across from him, Jack Preston, his longtime friend and fellow senior pilot, leaned forward. "You see the memo?" Jack asked, voice low but sharp. Grant exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I saw it." "Evaluation reform?" Jack scoffed, shaking his head. "You know what this means, right? This isn't just about how we fly. It's about control. If they push this through, seniority won't mean a damn thing anymore." Grant didn't respond right away. He knew what it meant. It meant pilots who had spent decades proving themselves could now be judged by the same criteria as newcomers. It meant the old ways, The way things had always been done were disappearing. It meant Naomi was winning. Jack narrowed his eyes. "You gonna let this happen?" Grant met his gaze. "No," Jack smirked. "Good, because I've been hearing whispers. Some of the guys—" He tilted his head toward a group of pilots across the room. "They're not happy. If you push back, they'll back you up." Grant nodded slowly. He had expected this. And now? Now he had a choice. He could stand down, accept the change, let someone like Naomi Vance rewrite the rules. Or he could fight back. His jaw tightened. There was only one real option. Naomi skimmed the latest flight performance reports from her desk in Denver, but her mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on the pushback. The memo about the evaluation reform had only been out for 12 hours, and already she was hearing the rumblings of discontent. Richard walked into her office without knocking, a folder tucked under his arm. "It's starting." She didn't look up. "I know." He set the folder down. "Grant Alden's your biggest problem. He's not just resisting, he's organizing." Naomi finally met his eyes. "Let me guess. He's rallying the old guard?" Richard nodded. "Some of the senior pilots see him as their voice. If he makes this a fight, they'll stand with him." Naomi exhaled, then leaned back in her chair. "What's their angle?" "They're calling it a safety issue," Richard said, "saying experience should always be valued over efficiency metrics, that newer pilots don't have the same instincts, the same ability to handle emergencies." Naomi scoffed. "They're dressing up resistance as concern?" "Of course they are." She was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she stood. "If they want a fight," she said, "they're going to get one." Richard smirked. "That's what I like to hear." Naomi grabbed her coat. "Where are you going?" Richard asked. She met his gaze. "To let Grant Alden know that I don't lose." And with that, she walked out, ready to face the storm head-on. The Denver airport crew lounge was quieter than usual, but the air crackled with tension. Naomi Vance could feel it the second she stepped inside. Conversations hushed. A few pilots exchanged glances, their expressions guarded. They all knew why she was here, and more importantly, they knew who she was here for. Grant Alden was sitting at a corner table, arms crossed, his eyes trained on the screen of his tablet. But Naomi knew he wasn't really reading. He was waiting. She walked up to his table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. "Captain Alden," she said smoothly. He looked up, finally meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet defiance, a refusal to back down. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. "I hear you've been busy." Grant exhaled sharply, a hint of a smirk touching his lips. "Word travels fast, I guess." "Especially when the word is resistance," she said evenly. "I don't have a problem with pilots voicing concerns, but I do have a problem when those concerns are being used to undermine leadership." Grant's jaw tensed. "So now questioning policy is considered insubordination?" "Not at all," Naomi said. "But rallying people against a system before giving it a chance? That's not leadership, Captain. That's obstruction." Grant shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "You want to talk about leadership? Leadership is earned, and respect isn't given just because someone has a title." Naomi didn't flinch. "Respect is earned, you're right. But tell me something, Captain. Am I supposed to earn respect from people who decided I didn't belong here before I even walked in the door?" Grant didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. She let the silence stretch before continuing. "This evaluation reform, it's happening. Not because I want to disrupt things, but because it's the right thing to do. Merit should matter more than tenure. Performance should outweigh politics." Grant exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think I'm against you just because I don't like change?" "I think you're against me because you don't like who is making the change." His jaw tightened. She had struck a nerve. Naomi stood, smoothing out the sleeves of her blazer. "You don't have to like me, Alden, but you do have to decide what kind of leader you really are." Grant remained silent as she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had already lost. Naomi had expected pushback. She hadn't expected a full-blown pilot protest. By the time she got back to her office, Richard was waiting for her, his phone in one hand, a tense look on his face. "We have a problem." She raised an eyebrow. "Just one?" Richard didn't smile. Grant's faction isn't just complaining. They're refusing non-mandatory training sessions. They're delaying sign-offs on junior pilot evaluations. Some are even calling in sick to cause last-minute scheduling issues. Naomi's grip on her coffee cup tightened. "They're trying to make it look like my policies are destabilizing the airline." "Exactly." Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling slowly. She had expected resistance, but this was calculated, a coordinated attempt to force her hand. She set her coffee down, her mind already working through the next steps. "How bad is the impact on operations?" she asked. "Not catastrophic," Richard admitted. "Yet. But if this keeps up, flights will start getting grounded. Delays will pile up. Passengers will notice." Naomi exhaled. "That's exactly what they want." Richard nodded. "They're banking on public pressure, forcing you to back down." Naomi sat back in her chair. "Then I guess I'll have to remind them who they're dealing with." Richard smirked. "That's the Naomi I know." She stood. "Get the legal team in here. If these pilots want to test me, let's see how they handle real turbulence." And just like that, the battle was officially out in the open. The tension inside Vanguard Airlines headquarters had reached its peak. The usual hum of controlled efficiency had been replaced by an undercurrent of unease. Pilots, executives, and operations managers were all waiting to see who would break first. Naomi Vance sat at the head of the long conference table in the executive boardroom. The room was filled with senior leadership, legal advisors, and most notably, a handful of representatives from the pilot corps. Grant Alden was one of them. He sat across from her, his expression carefully neutral. But Naomi could see the battle behind his eyes. He had led this protest, this resistance, believing she would cave under pressure. He had underestimated her. She placed her hands on the table, her voice calm but firm. "Let's get one thing straight. The evaluation reform is not up for debate. It's happening. The only question is whether you want to be a part of it or if you'd rather be left behind." Jack Preston, one of Grant's closest allies, scoffed. "You think you can just bulldoze through decades of tradition?" Naomi met his gaze without blinking. "I think I can hold this airline accountable to the future. Because if we don't evolve, we die." A murmur ran through the room. Some of the pilots exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just a corporate game anymore. It was survival. Grant exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "You don't get it, do you?" Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." "This isn't just about policy. It's about trust," he said. "You came in here, made your decisions without talking to us, without even trying to understand what it means to be a pilot, to be in that cockpit when things go wrong. And now you expect us to just fall in line?" Naomi studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quieter but sharper. "You're right," she said. "I'm not a pilot. I don't know what it feels like to be at 40,000 feet with an engine failing or a storm rolling in. But let me tell you what I do know, Captain Alden." She leaned forward slightly. "I know what it feels like to have the entire room doubt you before you even open your mouth. I know what it feels like to work twice as hard just to prove you deserve the same respect given freely to others. I know what it's like to fight for a seat at the table, even when everyone wants to pretend you don't belong there." The room was silent. Grant didn't move, didn't even blink. Naomi straightened. "So no, I don't know what it means to be a pilot, but I do know what it means to lead. And leadership means making decisions that aren't always popular. It means pushing forward, even when people like you try to hold us back." Another silence stretched across the room. Then unexpectedly, Mitchell Kane spoke. "I think she's right." All eyes turned to him. "She's right," Kane repeated, shifting in his seat. "The system is outdated. We all know it. We just don't want to admit it because change is uncomfortable." Jack shook his head in disbelief. "You're siding with her?" "I'm siding with the future," Kane said. Grant clenched his jaw. For the first time, Naomi saw hesitation in his face. She pressed forward. "This is the moment, Captain Alden. You can keep fighting me, keep dragging this airline into a war it doesn't need, or you can prove that you're the leader you claim to be." Grant's fingers tapped against the table. Slowly, thoughtfully. Then finally, he nodded. A small, reluctant nod. A surrender. "This isn't over," he muttered. Naomi smiled faintly. "Of course not. It never was." 1 month later, the dust had settled. The pilot protest had faded, the evaluation reforms were in place, and Vanguard Airlines had survived the turbulence. Naomi sat in her office, watching a plane taxi down the runway through the window. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Richard stepped in. "You have a visitor." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Who?" Richard smirked. "Grant Alden." Naomi leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Send him in." Grant stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his demeanor unreadable. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he spoke. "I took the new evaluation." Naomi tilted her head. "And?" His lips twitched into something almost like a smile. "Passed with flying colors," she nodded. "I never doubted you." Grant studied her for a long moment. Then with a small, reluctant chuckle, he extended a hand. Naomi took it, not as a surrender, but as an understanding. Because the fight was over, but the future was just beginning. Leadership isn't about holding on to the past, it's about shaping the future. Naomi Vance didn't just fight for a seat at the table, she changed the entire conversation. And Grant Alden? He learned that real strength isn't in resisting change, but in adapting to it. In the end, respect isn't given, it's earned. So what do you think? Can industries built on tradition truly evolve? Or will the old guard always push back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories that challenge power, inspire change, and keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.